Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's seminar here at SNS. My name is Johanna Ekvist, and I'm a project manager here at SNS. And this seminar is part of a collaboration between the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University and SNS. And our ambition with this collaboration is to bring insights from leading economists to the Swedish policy debate. And we feel very honored today to have the award-winning economist Elhanan Heltman with us. Elhanan is professor of international trade at Harvard University and one of the world's leading researchers of international trade. And he has contributed with new theories in international trade, political economy, and economic growth. And today Elhanan will talk about his upcoming book about the relationship between globalization and inequality. A very warm welcome to you, Elhanan. And we are also very glad to have Harry Flam with us here today. Harry is professor of international economics at the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. And he's also chairman of the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council. And Harry will give a comment and lead today's discussion. And a very warm welcome to you, Harry. Okay. And before we start, I just want to say that if you use Twitter, please use our hashtag SNSkunskap. And now we give another big applause to Elhanan Heltman. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to make this presentation, but as you can imagine, because I'm talking about a book, I won't provide too much detail. So I'll try to give you an overview of what it is about. So the book is called Globalization and Inequality, and it's expected to be published at the beginning of the summer, most likely in July. So broadly speaking, it covers two broad topics. One is the studies that address the relationship between trade and inequality, studies that started in the early 90s and took what I call a traditional approach. And then, due to the failure of this approach to explain the data, there has been a reevaluation by broadening the set of mechanisms that relate trade to inequality, and these have been studied later on. And as I will argue, independently of the nature of the approach and the variety of mechanisms that have been examined, the conclusion has been always quite similar. It's one of the amazing things that has happened, which is quite unusual in economics, where different econometric approaches or theoretical approaches or some mix of them typically yield a wide range of estimates. But in this case, the range of estimate is pretty narrow, as I will argue. So let me start with some historical background. The way we think about globalization is that there have been two broad waves of globalization. One started in the beginning of the 19th century. So according to Madison, and until about 1820, the share of goods traded internationally was very small. And then it started to increase until World War I, then it started to decline, and after World War II started the second wave. So in terms of background, there has been, at least since World War II, a very fast expansion of international trade relative to income. Now, how did this feed into inequality? So this is a big question that has been investigated in many different ways. But for our purposes, what I want to emphasize is the following. If you look here, we have a measure of inequality in the world economy. So this measure looks at the world as a single entity, and every individual is represented as an individual in this distribution. But then what you can do is you can take the measure of inequality generated in the world economy in this way and decompose it into what fraction of this inequality was generated within countries and what fraction is due to the fact that income per capita varies across countries. And what you see here is that most of the rise in inequality was driven by disparity in income per capita across countries. And the rise in inequality within countries has become very powerful and very strong only recently. I mean the recent few decades, yes, not the recent few years. The other point I want to make is that people who object to globalization basically don't care about what happens to inequality in the world economy. If you care about it, you should be aware of the fact that poverty has declined dramatically as international trade has expanded over time. And the measure that I show here is the fraction of people who live in what the World Bank defines as extreme poverty. And this fraction has dramatically declined over the years. Here the measure starts in 1981. And the number of people who live in extreme poverty has declined from close to 2 billion to 1.3 billion in 2008. So, we can argue whether this was related to globalization or not, or how important globalization was in enabling this decline in poverty. But at least in my mind, there's no doubt that globalization helped reducing poverty in these countries. So this is in terms of background. My storyline begins with what is known as the college wage premium. So the data we have here is for the United States, and in the lower panel what you see is the rise in the fraction of hours worked by people with a college degree. And what you see is essentially is that over the years, the fraction of people in the labor force with a college degree has been increasing in the United States steadily since the early 60s. On the other hand, the upper panel shows you what is known as the college wage premium. This is the advantage that college graduates have in labor compensation relative to high school graduates and below. And until about the mid-70s or late 70s, there was no particular pattern of rising college wage premium. It increased and then it declined. Yes? However, starting with the late 70s, the college wage premium in the US rose dramatically, and it kept rising until very recently. From the vantage point of economists in the early 90s who started to look at it, and this was mostly done originally by labor economists, what they observed was that starting with the late 70s, on the one hand, the relative supply of college graduates in the labor force had increased, but at the same time, their wage relative to the wage of high school graduates and high school dropouts has been increasing. So this is a sort of case. If you are an economist, you think, well, if the supply of something goes up, its price has to go down. And here, just the opposite happened. So labor economists became very interested in the question, why did it happen? How come that with a growing supply of college graduates, their relative wage kept rising? Now, this wasn't only a phenomenon in the US. This table sort of gives you inequality measures for a bunch of countries. This is the 90 to 10 percentile income ratio. And in many countries, you see this increase. In Sweden, it's relatively small during that period. But in the US, for example, it's very high. And people have documented this rising inequality in many other countries. So the question that was asked at the time is, what drove this rise in inequality? So a number of sort of hypotheses that were raised was declining unionization. This is particularly relevant for the US, where it has declined dramatically. The regulation of labor markets in various countries, product markets, capital markets. In the US, the decline in the minimum wage, because the minimum wage is legislated in nominal terms, and then over time, inflation bites into the minimum wage. Now, all of these hypotheses didn't find enough support in the evidence to explain the data. So it's not that it has zero explanatory power, but it's not enough to essentially explain it. For example, in the US, the minimum wage, which declined dramatically, had an impact mostly at the lower part of the wage distribution, but had basically no impact at the upper part. There were no spillovers from the bottom to the top, as you might have expected. So two hypotheses that became predominant in the literature were the following. One was trade. And the storyline there was that the integration of many less developed countries into the world trading system brought about a decline in the relative price of low-skill intensive products. And as a result, the relative wage of low-skilled workers declined in the advanced countries. So this was one hypothesis. The other hypothesis was that the technological development due to the internet revolution, computers and the like, brought about what economists call skill-biased technical change. So it's technical change that operates to the benefit of skilled workers, and therefore it raised the relative demand for skilled workers, and this brought about a hike in the college wage premium. The quantitative studies of the former effect basically came up with relatively small numbers. So the sort of studies that could explain more than some other studies the rise in the college wage premium using this trade mechanism. Those of you who took a course in international trade are familiar with the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. This is essentially the mechanism that people used here. They could explain about 20% of the change in the college wage premium. So 80% had to be explained by other things. And then what happened is that as a default, this labor economy said, look, this mechanism can explain 20%. It must be the case that the rest of it is explained by technological change. But as I will argue, the studies of technological change never established what we call causality. So in terms of correlations, there is plenty of evidence that things are correlated, but to what extent technical change caused these effects is sort of questionable. When people examined this, there were some features of the data that contradicted the trade explanation. And the most important feature is the following. If you study a Heckscher-Ohlin type economy, like we do in undergraduate classes and in some more sophisticated way in graduate classes, then when you have a price shock like the one I described before, which leads to changes in relative wages, the adjustment has to come from intersectoral allocation on one hand and within sectoral changes on the other. Now, if you hold constant relative prices and you just get an inflow of workers of a certain type, all the adjustment has to take place via allocation across sectors and none within sector. So the allocation within sector can only be fed through changes in relative prices. On the other hand, in the data, the shifts in employment was driven predominantly within sectors and in the opposite direction that you would expect. So if the relative wage of skilled workers goes up, you expect that every manufacturer, no matter whether they produce textiles, footwear, or computers, will use fewer skilled workers relative to unskilled workers. On the other hand, in the data, we saw just the opposite. So this sort of contradicts the trade explanation. And on the other hand, in a very interesting debates to which I cannot devote any time today, it turned out that if you took a view of technical change, then if the technical change was global rather than limited to particular countries, at least in qualitative terms, the data was consistent with the theory. Okay, so what are the sort of quantitative features that we have here? So here are some numbers from a study that was very important at the time. And what you see here is the following. At the bottom, the number tells you how the college wage premium changed between 1980 and 1995, measured in log points. Now, log points, I mean, it's an unusual metric, but this is what labor economists like, so this is what they usually report. So here we have the log points. Okay, so we have 0.19 log points change in the relative wage of college graduates. This is in the data. So then they used trade theory, in particular a certain approach that uses what we call factor content analysis, to estimate by how much relative wages should change in view of the change in the trade pattern of the United States. This is a study of the US. Okay, so you calculate these changes, which the origin of this is a famous paper by Vasily Leontiev from 1953. And this method has been greatly refined over the years. So they do this estimate and they define the following. In the middle line, you see that if the elasticity of substitution between skilled and unskilled worker is 2, you get a shift of 0.07 in log points. If the elasticity of substitution is 1.41, you get a shift of 0.01. If it's 1, it's 0.014. So, okay. Now, why are these different elasticities of substitution? In a famous paper in 1992, Murphy and Katz estimated this elasticity of substitution. They found that it's 1.41. So this is the estimate, and the two other numbers are for sensitivity analysis. But the critical point here is that this explains about 5% of the data. So they factored in migration, in particularly of low-skilled workers into the US, and they got another 5%. So altogether, you can explain with this type of mechanisms about 10% of the data. Harry, until when am I talking here? 10 past 9. 10 past 9, okay. Do you prefer me to talk faster or shorter? Okay, so I just skipped some things. So the data on how much adjustment took place within sectors as opposed to across sectors The first set of estimates was done for the US, and this is for the US and some other countries, and this is what you see here. So you see in Sweden, for example, 60% of the adjustment took place within sector as opposed to across sector. In Belgium, it was over 90%. The critical point is that in all the countries that have been studied at the time, the majority of adjustment took place within sector rather than across the sectors, which is inconsistent with this type of trade explanation. So now the question is, can we explain what happened at the time by skill bias technical change? This is very difficult, actually, because it's very hard to come up with good measures of technical change. And it's well known, for example, there is a famous theorem by Diamond, McFadden, and Rodriguez from 1978, in which says that if you try to estimate the skill bias of technical change, you have to commit to an elasticity of substitution, and basically you cannot estimate them jointly. So you have to take a stand on some issues in order to entangle these things. So what the studies did was they basically did a bunch of correlations. For several countries which are listed here, which includes Sweden, what people found was that in sectors with faster increase in the demand for non-production workers, these are workers who are typically considered to be more skilled, these are sectors which are more innovative, sectors that invest more in R&D relative to their revenue, and they were also more intensive in computer use. So this is a sort of indication that the shift in the demand for skilled workers, in this case non-production workers, was correlated with these features of technology across sectors. This was sort of strengthened in another study by Berman Machine in 2000, and they used a variety of countries, some poor countries, some rich countries, some middle-income countries. And in all of these countries, the groups of countries, they found that the skill upgrading that I mentioned before, and we saw in the graph before, for some countries, that this was positively correlated with the upgrading of skills in the US. So it seems that there was this co-movement within industries across many countries in the world at different levels of development, and therefore this appears to be consistent with the view that there was technical change, worldwide technical change, and we are very good at writing down models extracting what this type of technical change is doing, and you can write out a model that will show that this will lead to a rise in the college wage premium. In fact, it can bring about a rise in many countries. So another hypothesis that was pursued at the time, and in fact until this very day it's being studied, is the expansion of offshoring. So this is a measure of offshoring in the world economy. And you can calculate a similar measure for different countries. And what you see here is that until about the 1980s or late 80s, offshoring was relatively flat. And then it started to climb. And then the question was, to what extent is offshoring responsible for this movement in relative wages? So there were a number of studies that looked, for example, at foreign direct investment, and there were theoretical developments which tried to underpin these studies. And again, in terms of correlations, you find this type of correlation that, I give you an example, a study of U.S. investment in Mexico, in particular in the south of the U.S., where U.S. companies establish what they call maquiladoras in Mexico, which are outlets in which products were assembled. So they shifted intermediate inputs to the south, and then they were assembled there, and they shifted them back to the north. So in this type of study, there were these correlations that were consistent with the view of how FDI of this sort should have affected relative wages. A particularly important study that tried to disentangle the role of trade versus technology in the US was a study by Finstra and Hanson. And what I have done here, I summarize 3 types of estimates that they have. And the difference between the different estimates, yes, comes from the way they treat what they call high technology capital and computers. So the question is, do you give more weight to recent investments as compared to older investments? So the vintages sort of become important. But the bottom line is that the average estimate using these decompositions is that trade can explain about 20% of the change in the US college wage premium. Okay, so there were a variety of difficulties in this approach, and the question was, can we do better? One particularly horny issue was that the movement in these relative wages was similar in less developed and more developed countries, and if you are familiar with a Heckscher-Ohlin type model, then it's going to tell you that what trade should do is move relative wages in opposite directions in rich countries and in poor countries. And this is sort of what we didn't see in the data. Okay, so I'm going to skip some of this stuff because I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later. Another point that came out was that if you look at different parts of the distributions, then the inequality moved not necessarily in the same direction. In some countries like the US, there was an increase in the inequality at the bottom of the distribution, at the upper part of the distributions. In other, like in Canada, there was a slight decline at the bottom and a rise at the top. Any case, I don't have time to go over this. So where did the literature go? So there was an attempt to say, look, maybe we, namely the economists, we take a too simplistic approach to the topic. You know, we sort of emphasize what we love and cherish, which is a sort of Heckscher-Ohlin type approach, and we emphasize the Stolper-Samuelson mechanism, but maybe there are other mechanisms that operate, and they prove to be much more useful for explaining this type of data. So there was a new literature developed that emphasized new mechanisms. One of them is assortative matching. And this mechanism is sort of important for the following reason. You can think about how workers are matched to jobs, or how they are matched with firms, more productive, more sophisticated firms, or less productive, less sophisticated firms. And the theory of matching tells you that the pattern of wages will be determined by this matching process. And then if you have international trade or you have some shock in the world economy, this shock is going to generate a rematching of workers with managers, with firms, with industries. And this rematching will impact the inequality of wages. And the question is, how much inequality can you generate via this mechanism on top or in addition to what we saw before? The other issue that people started to pay attention to was regional disparity. And here the point is, okay, if we think about the economy as an aggregate unit, we think that if somebody is a high school graduate, he or she should get the same wage independently in which region of the country they live or in which industry they work. But then if you look at the data, there is substantial variation. And although, for example, in the US, the general view was that there's a lot of labor mobility, in fact, studies started to note that labor mobility was quite limited. And then the question is, if you have local labor markets, then maybe a lot of disparity can be generated across these local labor markets. And then if you get a trade shock, the trade shock may widen disparity in wages across these local labor markets. So this is another set of studies that are. Then there's the issue of firm heterogeneity. As some of you know, there was a sort of revolution in the theory of international trade that started in the early 2000s, which introduced firm heterogeneity as an important determinant of trade flows. And if you take this view, then heterogeneity of firms can induce heterogeneity of wage structures, and in particular, if you combine it with matching and sorting that I mentioned before, and then the question is, how important has this been? Then there is an issue that was raised actually quite early in the debate, but with no quantitative or theoretical underpinning, and this is the following. So there's a book by Adrian Wood in 1994. It's a big book with a lot of numbers, but he raises the following hypothesis. He said, look, I make the calculations and I don't get much traction. But maybe what's happening is that trade affects wages not only directly, but also indirectly. Namely, if a country trade, what it does is trade induces technical change in particular directions. And as this induced technical change will affect wages, and maybe this will be more powerful than the outright direct impact of trade on wages of the type that we discussed before. And then he says, well, this sounds reasonable to me, but I don't know how to calculate it, basically. So this is where it was left, and then it was picked up later on. And the last point in the newer literature made the following observation. If you look across countries, then you see that a large component of wage inequality is what labor economists call residual wage inequality. Namely, after you control for all the observables, so for the economists in the audience, if you run a Mincer equation of log wages on education level, experience, gender, and the like, you still get a big residual of inequality. And the question is this residual related somehow to trade? Because if the residual is big, then maybe trade is moving this big residual, and this is more important than moving the impact of the observable features, such as education, on the structure of relative wages. Okay, so these are the sort of newer things that people consider. So there's a bunch of theoretical studies that explores sorting and matching that I mentioned before. And because Harry said I shouldn't talk too much, I'm going to skip it.
I give you 5 more minutes.
Oh, my God. Okay, so I won't go into the theory, but the theory is actually quite fascinating. So you'll have to read the book. Now we basically have no choice. At some point, you'll have to read the book, right? So let me go to some estimates. The interesting thing about this approach is that it's very rich in different dimensions. And even when you write down a theoretical model, when you look at the data can tell you what features or what assumptions to make it consistent with the data, and which assumptions basically if you make, you know for sure it's going to fail. So for example, one feature of the data that guided the theoretical analysis is that if you look across different type of workers, in this case it's workers in 5 occupations and you split them into managers and managerial workers and other workers, what you see is across industries, the mean earnings of managers and workers are positively correlated. Now, if you write down the theoretical model can give you a negative correlation or a positive correlation. But if you accept the data, you want a positive correlation, you make assumptions on it, then this feeds certain features of the theoretical model, and then you stick to the theoretical predictions that are consistent with this type of correlations. So, for example, one implication of this, and this was studied on Brazilian data, we didn't do it on Swedish data, what happens is that there is a negative correlation between the dispersion of compensation levels of workers and managers under these circumstances, and this obviously has some implications which you should blame Harry. I just cannot explore and I can't explain in any detail. Okay, but one thing which is sort of important is that there are quantitative studies of these matching models, and a very nice paper is available by Lee. She is she's a professor in the US. And what she did was she constructed a full-blown model of many countries and many industries, and then estimated its parameters and ran experiments trying to assess to what extent changes in inequality were driven by matching. And what I have done in this slide is I give you 2 type of estimates that come from her model. In fact, the second estimate she just provided in private communication. The first one is reported in the paper. So the experiments, I will explain. Take the following feature. So you calibrate the model on data at some point. And then you ask the question, suppose we change the cost of trade, and this can be because of transport costs or tariffs or whatever, and we look at the decline in these costs over time so as to match the expansion of trade of the countries in the sample. Okay? Then we can ask the question, this trade expansion, how is it going to impact compensation of workers in different categories of workers? So here we have high school dropouts, the left column, and the rightmost column is people with advanced degrees, which means above college degrees. And in between, we have other type of workers. So we have high school dropouts, high school graduate, people with some college degree, college graduates, and advanced degrees. And what you see in the first row is the percentage response of their real wages to this decline in trade costs. In principle, the decline in trade costs can be due to trade liberalization, but it doesn't have to be. And what you see here is indeed that the least skilled workers gain in real wages less than the higher skilled workers, but the gaps are very small. So what this says is the trade mechanism explains a slight increase in inequality between, say, college graduates and high school dropouts, but this change is not that big. So, for example, the most that the skilled workers gain is 1.8% in real terms, and the high school dropouts gain only 1.15%. So the gap is not small, it's small, and we know that the spread in this compensation was, it started like, something like 45% and went up to 75% and then even higher to 90%. So this obviously cannot explain this type of data. The other thing in the second row, which has even smaller numbers, come from an exercise which says, well, we know that many people blame China for all the ills of the American economy, yes? It's a good day to say it. So she asked the following question. Suppose that we take estimates of productivity growth in China and we feed them into her model and then ask the question, how will this productivity growth affect the wage structure in the US? And the numbers are in the second row. And you see they are very small. So again, there is a slightly higher wage gain for high-skilled workers as opposed to low-skilled workers, but this is really very minor. Okay, so I wanted to discuss the impact of Mercosur on the wage structure in Brazil, but again, because of Harry, I cannot do it. So I'll proceed to China. Okay, so what is the sort of evidence that brought people to blame China for everything, yes? So this gives you the sort of share in trade of China in the US. And the US is the heavy bars, and China is represented by the light bars. And what you see is that the share of the US in manufacturing trade has been declining compared, this is not in absolute terms, it's relative to the volume of trade. And of China has been rising dramatically, and China's share in world trade in manufacturers is now bigger than the US, basically. And don't ask me about deficits, trade deficits, it's a thorny issue. Okay, so there has been a whole set of studies of the impact of China on the US economy. The most prominent is a paper by author Dorn and Hanson, and I will summarize it in the following way. They ask the following question. If we look at the expansion of Chinese trade across industries, how did it feed into wages and employment in the US? And what was special about this study, their study at the time, this study was published 5 years ago, is that they were the first to actually estimate the impact of trade on what I described earlier as local labor markets. So they used what they call commuting zones, which is a well-defined economic region, and there are 700 of them, about 700 in the US. So these are zones in which people basically, they can live in it and commute to work. And this is what predominantly limits these zones. So they used, for those of you who do econometrics, it's sort of important to emphasize the methodology that they use. So they used diff and diff estimates across these commuting zones. And what they found was in some ways strong and in other ways strange. So in terms of strangeness, they found little effect on wages of workers in manufacturing. On the other hand, there were relatively bigger impacts on wages of workers in non-manufacturing industries in these commuting zones. And so wages fell more relatively in commuting zones that were more exposed to competition from China. The other thing that they found was that the employment effects were stronger than the wage effects. In terms of inequality between skilled and unskilled workers, basically there's nothing there in these estimates. So what made the headlines of this paper was the argument that Essentially, you can explain the shifts in employment across these commuting zones on the one hand, and you can also explain the shift in transfers, in particular unemployment benefits, social security, health insurance, and things of this sort. Now, methodologically, if you do this type of estimation, you basically cannot estimate the aggregative effect. So in order to say something about what happens to aggregate employment, they had to make some strong assumptions, which I think the journalists who wrote about it didn't figure out, or nobody explained it to them. But so the question that I want to pose now is the following. Suppose that we accept all these assumptions to calculate these aggregates. Then are we talking about big numbers or small numbers? I should also say that this same type of China shock that was examined on German data found much smaller effects, both employment and transfers and everything else. So in the case of China, in the case of Germany, what was more important was the trade patterns of the East European countries rather than the Chinese. But the important thing that I want to emphasize now is what are the aggregate effects. So I'll jump straight to an estimate that came out a couple of years ago of the total employment impact. This is the largest estimate that essentially exists, and it says that the China shock reduced employment in manufacturing in the US economy by about 2.4 million workers. So, 2.4 million workers is a big number, but the US economy, as you know, it's also a big economy. And the question is, what's the sort of relevant benchmark? So one benchmark that you can use is to ask the question, what's the rate of labor turnover in the US economy? And the estimates of labor turnover in the US economy range between 9 million to 12 million workers per quarter. And the estimate of the 2.4 million job losses was over a 10-year period. So if you look compared to the labor turnover, it's really a small number. Now, this doesn't mean that there weren't workers who suffered, right? Because some did. And the point is that these regional effects, they could be stark. And so in some regions, perhaps people were hit quite hard. But as far as the aggregate economy is concerned, at the macro level, the China shock is not a big deal in the US, at least in this sense. Now, this is a particular way to estimate things. So another way to estimate things comes from structural estimation. And here, the numbers are much smaller. Moreover, people who use structural estimation, they used more detailed models, and also they took explicit account of exports, whereby these reduced form estimates don't account for export properly. Now, why is this important? For the following reason. In the US, the share of imported intermediate inputs that are used in production, and then in many cases for re-exporting, has doubled over this period. So if you can import cheaper intermediate inputs, this boosts up production generally, and in particularly production for exports. And then if exports expand, this raises employment. So if you focus only on import competition, you are going to miss employment expansion, and therefore your estimates will be too low. And so in this case, they find that essentially there isn't really a loss of jobs. Okay, so I'm going to skip a lot of stuff. And there's one It's really interesting, the stuff I'm skipping. You know? I just want to show you these estimates. So these estimates come from a paper by Burstein and Vogel from last year. And what they did was they introduced a mixture of mechanisms of the type that I discussed before. So they introduced matching across heterogeneous firms together with changes in technology used by different firms. In particular, firms that are more productive in their model, they use more skill-intensive technologies. Now, this has the property that those of you who are familiar with the sort of what's called the new trade theory, that if you get a trade liberalization shock, you get more selection into exporting, and selection into exporting is driven by the more productive firms. So if these firms expand and they use their technology uses relatively more skilled workers, then this is going to increase the demand for skilled workers, and it will beef up their wages relative to the unskilled. Okay, so it's a sort of complex mechanism that built in, and these are the estimates that they get. If you just look at the right-hand side, it essentially tells you by how much the skill premium rises when countries go from autarky to trade in a particular year. In this case, it's 2005, 2007. And what you see here is that, again, the estimates, despite the sophisticated mechanisms that's built in, are not that large. The country that has the largest increase in the skill premium is Latvia, and the skill premium rises by 12%, which is very small compared to actual movements that took place in other countries. In the US, it rises just a little. So this mechanism doesn't work as well. Okay, I think, Harry, I just took up more than you are allowed me. So I'm going to skip all of this. And I'll finish with this figure. So I mentioned before, maybe I should take another half minute. Look, I'm saving you reading, so it's okay. Okay, so this data just shows you the size of residual inequality, which I mentioned earlier on. So that's the question, how much of the wage movements can be explained by observables such as education, experience, and gender versus residual inequality. So here we have in Brazil, data for Brazil and Sweden, and what you see is in Sweden, the residual inequality is quite large. And what's more important is that if you look at how things change over time, then the increase in wage inequality over time was driven primarily by residual inequality, changes in residual inequality. And this is true both in Brazil and in Sweden. So potentially there are a lot of possibilities in explaining the data using residual inequality. So there are some papers which study mechanisms through which trade affects residual inequality. And they are very interesting. You should read them, right? But what I'm going to do is just show you a simulation from a full-scale model that was estimated on Brazilian data and which focuses on residual inequality. So what the model does, basically, it's being estimated on Brazilian data around the formation of Mercosur. So, Brazil became a member of Mercosur in 1991 was when the agreement was reached. And then you can look at data before 91 and data after 91 and see to what extent has inequality changed and to what degree was it driven by shifts in residual inequality. So this simulation uses different forms of trade liberalization, and it basically says that about 10% of the rise in inequality can be explained with this. Now, this is actually important for the following reason, that in Brazil, wage inequality declined during that period. So this means that other forces generate even more declines, because some of it was driven by this residual inequality mechanism. And this is an underestimate also, because it doesn't account for the fact that various firms have been exporting to multiple countries. If you allow for this, you double essentially the size of this estimate. So this is a potentially interesting mechanism, but it has been studied only for one country and for one episode, while the other mechanism has been studied for multiple countries and multiple episodes. So now, to make her happy, I'm going to conclude. All right? Okay, so I think we agree that, generally speaking, trade affects earning inequality, but these effects take place through multiple channels. And from what we know now, it's clear that you cannot explain the data using a single channel. It's just not good enough. Trade contributes to residual inequality, as I have just argued, and also it affects inequality through the sort of usual composition of the labor force. But if we are to understand its impact on the wage distribution, or more broadly on income distribution, we really have to move away from these simple categories that were originally used, which is aggregating workers into two categories, because there are significant differences across different categories of workers, and this requires both a different type of theory and a different type of estimation. So heterogeneity of inputs, in a sort of broader sense, sets in motion a set of mechanisms that have been only recently studied. They appear to be useful, but so far they haven't really delivered large numbers. So we still don't have estimates which say, yes, trade is the culprit of rising inequality. And so we have to conclude that based on available evidence, while trade contributes somewhat to rising inequality, it's certainly not the major factor. And in a lot of the public discussion, people really don't look at the evidence. They form beliefs, that trade or globalization is causing this huge rise in inequality. But unfortunately, many of these beliefs are not based on evidence. And here's where I'll stop.
Thank you. Erkanan, please take a seat over there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Maybe I should start with asking you and the audience if you have any immediate question, maybe for clarification from Erkanan before we go on. You understood everything. Everything is clear. That's good. I also want to thank Erkanan, and I want to assure the audience that there is no more authoritative account of what research has taught us than the one given by Erkanan. Now, I want to take a Swedish perspective on what we heard today. And first of all, I think it's quite striking. I think for most people who are not familiar with this material, that trade has a comparatively small role to play in the rising wage inequality registered in the US. But to a Swede, the whole focus on the college wage premium seems to be a little bit misplaced, because we don't have the same development in Sweden. In fact, if we look at the dispersion of disposable income, which is not the same thing, but what you find there, if you look at the development from the 80s until today, most of the action is in capital income and not in wage income. It appears that wage dispersion has been more or less constant all of this period. And so this leads me to my first comment, and that is, when you look at these data across countries, as you showed us, you find a big variety in results in wage dispersion. And so obviously there are many different factors. All of these countries have been exposed about to the same extent, or perhaps even more, to trade, to globalization. And yet we find very different developments in wage dispersion. Could we learn more from looking at cross-country studies? You know, are there any cross-country studies that have tried to extract more information doing this by that approach than focusing, so much on the U.S. development? Another little bit surprising finding is that so much action is within industries, within firms, and comparatively little in terms of reallocation between different activities, different industries. But also in this respect, we see some differences across countries. In the table that you showed us, Sweden has about half of the action is within firms, and half of the action is from reallocation between different activities. And I think that in the minds of most people, it's job losses, job displacement that is the most important negative effect of globalization. And I think that even in the U.S. perception, maybe the wage dispersion is not the first thing that people talk about, is job displacement. And there are some studies, as you showed, but perhaps more focus should be placed on trying to explain why we see these differences across countries. For someone who hasn't followed the research so closely in recent years on this subject, but in the 90s, I find that in the 90s, basically, it was established then that trade's contribution was comparatively small, about 20% from the traditional approach. And now we learn that, looking at other channels, it's not much more than that. But we have the question of directed technical change, the question that Adrian Wood brought up in his book that you mentioned. And the two papers that you refer to in the book don't find much more action from that source. But my question to you is that, have we really exhausted that topic? I mean, isn't it possible that, since we found in the 70s, using the traditional approach, that only 20% of the rise in this skill premium could be explained by the traditional approach, and now if we look at directed technical change, shouldn't that give us something more, so that it's not 20%, perhaps it's much more than that? I mean, do we have a conclusive answer to that question? One other question I want to put to you is that if you gave this lecture to the American president, would he be impressed?
Why would I do it?
Would he be impressed? I mean, what I'm referring to is not his mental faculties. It's it's the political economy of trade policy. I mean, we can show that trade has a very small effect, but nevertheless, trade is always a scapegoat, or very much so. Have you anything to say on the policy aspect of these findings?
Well, these are many heavy questions. Let me start 2 points from the very end. One is what's causing people to form expectations or beliefs concerning the impact of globalization on inequality or other aspects. So the fact of the matter is that there is a real contradiction in findings in the following sense. If you look at survey data of attitudes, then there are sort of standard questions being asked. Do you think that international trade or international business are good for your economy? Then overwhelmingly people say, yes, it's good. And in large numbers. And this is true across countries, including the US. So in the US, there was some decline in the fraction of the people who say yes. And then it rose again, and it stands now on about 70%. So 70% of Americans say, yes, it's good. And in less developed countries, the numbers are even bigger. So the attitudes are generally, people say, yes, it's a good thing to have international trade, international business, and so on. But then when it comes to the nitty-gritty, then people say, no, we should not allow import competition. This is destroying our jobs. It's hurting our wages, and so on. Now, this contradiction is really a topic for psychology more than economics. But I think at some point, maybe economists should come up with explanations of how these two attitudes coexist. And they do, and they have coexisted for a long time. Now, as far as the induced technical change hypothesis that you mentioned, there are really no other studies except the ones I mentioned in the book, and there the numbers are not that big. One interesting issue which I discuss also is the following, and this has to do with the way economists do empirical studies. And the typical thing is that we look at a mechanism and we try to estimate its effects. We are not as good, unfortunately, in trying to estimate the combinations of several mechanisms. Now, why is this potentially important? Because some mechanisms might interact with each other, and the combined effect will be bigger than the sum of the two effects when estimated separately. So this is possible, but since it has not been done systematically, it's hard to know, how it will play out. The only studies in which some combinations of mechanisms have been examined are the structural models, which then are calibrated and run on counterfactuals. So these models, occasionally they contain more than one mechanism. Now, I've reported some of these findings, but generally speaking, they do not find big effects, although they don't have induced technical change typically. So, on one hand, we might say, this is terrible, we don't have really good answers to such a central question. On the other hand, we might say, no, it's not so bad, this way we won't be unemployed, we still have things to do, right? So we'll keep writing papers, we'll keep writing books, there are still open questions to examine. But the point is, of course, that there are issues that it's very hard to study them. In the last 15 years or so, the sophistication of what we can do has increased dramatically. And it has increased dramatically both in theoretical terms, in the empirical methods, and in the type of data that we have available that we didn't have available before. So all of this should help. But as I report in the book, it helps to examine a variety of additional mechanisms. It does not help in explaining the rise in inequality. And this is where we are.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience at this point? We have a few minutes left. There is one question here. You'll get the microphone.
Yes, I'm very glad that you mentioned that models and bricks have improved and data as well. So I was thinking Sweden is a country with very good microdata, firm level. We can connect persons to jobs, and so is there any type of encouragement that you would like to give to researchers in Sweden? These are the questions you should focus on, considering the good data that you have.
Absolutely. Yes.
Anyone else?
Now, maybe I should mention, since you mentioned this, the use of worker firm match data sets are very important for the study of a variety of these issues. So there are some studies, but very few actually. And I think this is the right direction to go.
Sorry, this is maybe a little bit off topic because it's not about inequality, but since we have the world's foremost expert on trade issues here, so lingering in the background of the current trade wars and Trump's China policy and so on, is also that there is not just sort of the competition per se, but also that there is theft of IP going on, like intellectual property theft. Now, is there any research evidence on that, or is it just sort of folklore? Or do we not know?
I don't know. I haven't seen detailed studies of this. I mean, it comes mostly, as far as I understand, from reports of American companies which are forced to transfer technology to China if they want to do business there. Now, the extent of this, I think, is unknown, and its effects, at least I am not familiar with studies that have estimated these effects.
Now, I just want to say that the iron law of SNS meetings is that we should, under no circumstances, exceed the time limit. But maybe we have time for one question. Jonas, you were first. Okay.
Yes, we know from this research that where you work has become much more important, which firm you're at, as opposed to who you are. And one old idea behind trade was that it will compete away firm-level rents. But of course, it is also possible that trade can generate substantial rents. So is it, when you've gone over this whole literature, is there like evidence on trade increasing or decreasing firm-level rents, or if these like firm effects can be accounted for by trade in a very broad sense?
Yeah, there is no hard evidence on these issues because to measure rents is very difficult. There are some estimates that are based on models of rent sharing. So, for example, there's a study of Indonesia where the model used for the study is using rent sharing between workers and firms. There are theoretical models that do it. The situation is that if you introduce rent sharing versus just pure forms of monopolistic competition and things of this type, the empirical relationship between the nature of the firm and the wage compensation is not very different. So it's just a matter of, the size of the effect or what sort of parameters go into it. But the empirical relationships look very similar. And therefore, I think it's generally speaking very difficult to untangle from the data what is the nature of the competition, whether it's rent sharing or just markups and things of this sort. Because the empirical relationship looks exactly the same. And these empirical relationships have been estimated. But then you have to interpret the estimates, and you cannot, generally speaking, decompose it into the rent-sharing components versus markup or other things. It's unfortunate, but this is how it is.
Okay, I'm sorry, but we have to stop here. Johanna, you have something to say.
So this marks the end of today's seminar, and on the behalf of SNS, I would like to thank you, Elhanan and Harry, for very interesting discussions, and also a big thank you to you in the audience for coming here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.